Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the history of BBC Micro typing games. If you missed episode 1, then I'd highly recommend checking that out to get more of an idea of what this series is about. But in essence, I'm making my way through the golden years of the BBC Micro and beyond, looking at typing games that were published in a variety of magazines over the years. I'll check out games from a variety of genres and determine whether it was ever actually worth the time it took to type them in. I'll also be taking a look at the programme listings and picking out any interesting articles from each of the publications to give an overview of how the world of home computing was evolving over those years. In this episode, I'll be completing my look back at 1982, the first full year of the Beeb's commercial life, and I have 5 more magazines and game listings to delve into, covering September to December of that year. This episode sees the series debut of 3 more publications: Your Computer, Acorn User, and kicking things off, Popular Computing Weekly. Here we have the first of 2 issues of Popular Computing Weekly that I'm going to look at in this episode. This is a magazine I wasn't aware of before starting this series. I never encountered it when I was a kid, but it looks quite interesting. For 35p you get a magazine that's fairly small. It's 28 pages, but it contains a number of games listings and other information as well. I think for 35p a week that seems like good value. Given that there were no budget games available and a normal game would cost you at least £5 or £6, this seems like quite a cheap way to spend your pocket money to get a game every week. So yeah, pretty cool. It's got a nice image on the front cover. This is very different to some of the other magazines we looked at in the first episode, in as much as they use artwork on the covers, and this artwork's got a spaceship with some kind of winged creature behind it, and that has particular significance because the game that I'm going to be looking at from this issue is the game that's featured on the front there. The cover story says Tarragon on the BBC, and that's what I'm going to be looking at. Also mentioned on the front cover is the Jupiter Ace. We take the lid off the Jupiter Ace, play Simon on your BBC, not really interested in that. Spectrum Stock Control, again, doesn't sound very appealing for a Spectrum user, this particular issue. And also Vic Relocation, and there's also a competition to win a Dragon 32 and £2,000 worth of advertising. Not really sure who that's going to appeal to, but there you go. So let's have a flick through this magazine and see if there's anything of interest. Obviously there are a number of adverts in there which I'm not going to get into in too much detail. There is an editorial here on the contents page. Let's just zoom in and take a little closer look at that. And as you can see, it's talking about the Jupiter Ace, launched last month as a new kind of low-cost micro. Designed by Richard Altwasser and Steve Vickers, the team responsible for Sinclair's ZX Spectrum, the Jupiter Ace consists of a Z80A microprocessor complete with 8K ROM, 3K RAM and a 32x24 display. No idea if that was actually good or not. It doesn't sound that good. It goes on to say, while the hardware is fairly standard, the software is decidedly different. The Jupiter Ace is the first micro to use Forth. Almost every other micro on the market uses some form of BASIC. It then goes on to talk about what Forth is and how it's supposedly easier to use than BASIC and things like that. I'm not going to go into too much detail there because the Jupiter Ace is heavily covered in this edition of the magazine. So moving on to the next page, this is quite interesting. Obviously the Spectrum had been out a few months by this point, and new from Fuller is the ZX Spectrum FD system, which basically gives it a professional keyboard and case. You'll see a lot of adverts like this in the next few editions of magazines that we're looking at, because these seem to be quite popular, giving the rubber keyed Spectrum a more professional look and feel. What's more interesting across these 2 pages though is the news desk, so I'm going to zoom in and take a closer look at that. Couple of articles at the top here. First, the Christmas launch for the Commodore Max. The new Commodore Max is to be launched in the UK just before Christmas. Goes on to tell you all about the Commodore Max, but what's interesting is this system was never released in the UK or almost any country for that matter. It's believed that the Commodore Max was only ever officially released in Japan. It was pretty much a flop, with the VIC-20 already being quite popular and the Commodore 64 gaining popularity at this point, and both of those being much more powerful machines. The Max was considered one of the duds of the Commodore range, and that of course means that it's now very rare and also valuable. And the other interesting article on this page is the age of the game. It's now possible to annihilate space invaders between London and Scotland. In an experiment being conducted by British Rail, selected trains from Euston to Inverness will carry a Space Invaders machine along with the sandwiches in the buffet car. The machines were supplied by Bellfruit UK, and introduction of the machines was the idea of Peter Dunkley, a member of BR's Transport Technology Assessment Group. So basically, yeah, there's a picture there of somebody playing Space Invaders on a cocktail cabinet in a train, presumably. It's not entirely clear whether that's a picture from within the train or just a stock picture of somebody playing a Space Invaders machine. But at the bottom there it says, if the scheme is successful, the idea may be extended to other long distance services. So if you have any memories of ever playing a Space Invaders machine or other arcade machine on a train, then let me know in the video comments. So moving on, we're going to skip past some of these pages now. We've got a letters page, but here's the listing for Tarragon, the game for the BBC Micro. I'm going to come back to that though, because before that I want to just take a look at a couple of pages about the Jupiter Ace. So here's the review. It says the Jupiter Ace makes 4th bid for stardom, and obviously there's a big 2-page review, lots of pictures of the machine being built or whatever as well, and a picture of the machine there at the top. I'm not going to go into too much detail looking at it. Let's just have a look at the summary for this review. And the reviewer says, I have a feeling the Ace might well find a market as a cheap way of learning Forth in schools and colleges for some, and for others a cheap way of obtaining a machine with the speed of Forth, not far slower than poorly written machine code, for control applications. And he goes on to say the Ace talks via a television and a rear port, which sounds a bit strange that it talks via the television, unless that just means how it displays stuff on screen, which is pretty much how every computer would at that point in time. So this review seems to suggest that the Jupiter Ace was probably more geared towards professional applications than game playing. I suppose really all computers are intended for that purpose first and foremost at this point. The Ace itself was a bit of a flop, I think, all told. I don't think it sold very many units, and it's one of those machines rather like the Dragon 32 and the Auric that faded into insignificance by the mid-80s. So moving on to the next 2 pages, we've got this open forum where people are encouraged to submit their own listings for programs, and this does include games, and we will come to look at this in more detail, come to look at the second edition of this magazine that I'm looking at in this episode. So let's skip through that now, other than to note that there's a listing here for Puckman on the VIC-20, which has got a maze layout drawn there, but let's move on. Lots more program information for various machines there, some classified ads there, and then the final inside cover page of the magazine has an advert for the Jupiter Ace, just to finish off our look at that, and it says probably the fastest computer in the universe, the Jupiter Ace, only $89.95. It says for $89.95 you'll receive your Jupiter Ace, a mains adapter, all the leads needed to connect to most cassette recorders and TVs, a software catalogue and manual. So that's the magazine covered. Let's now go back and look at the listing for Tarragon, which is the featured game in the magazine and the one that I'm interested in as well. Here it is. So firstly, much like the image on the front cover, there's another picture here of a big winged creature flying around. It's got a big serpent's tail as well, and that'll become clear as to why that is when we read the description of the game. Let's zoom in to do that because it's quite hard to read zoomed out that far. So Tarragon is a new game for the BBC Micro by A. Snell. I'll just skip the first paragraph because that doesn't really tell you a great deal. What it says in the second paragraph is the recently established colony on the planet Beta Strigidae, or something like that, has been under attack from huge winged reptiles, the semi-sentient Tarragon. Your task is to destroy the incoming waves of monsters before they reach the settlements. Each member of the PDF, that's interesting, PDF meant something different then, it meant Planetary Defence Force rather than portable document format. You must deal with 5 of the creatures in each attack, and there's intense competition within the force to shoot them down in as short a time as possible. It then goes on to describe the controls, which is AZ and the greater than less than signs, and also spacebar to fire energy beam weapon. If the Tarragon moves out of your field of view for too long, you'll lose it and incur a time penalty. The score shown on your display is the time taken to shoot down the number of Tarragons shown in the hits column, plus any time penalties for missed monsters. And you're also aiming for the record, giving the fastest time achieved so far. So that's the overview of what the game is. Let's have a look now at what it says about the program. It says it's been especially written for the BBC Micro, makes use of many advanced sound and graphics features of the machine. It will run a Model B or a Model A with 32K memory. A look at the program listing shows that it's been written almost entirely as a set of procedures, so should be easy to follow. We'll see that in a moment. Of special interest is the simple procedure to draw the Tarragon at line 2000. This makes use of the plot 86 statement. So that's something we didn't see in the first episode of this series, graphical plotting commands, so we'll have a look at those in a little bit more detail in a minute. It then goes on to say if a longer game is required, the number of Tarragon to be shot down can be increased by changing the limit in line 50. The procedure called rules at line 4500 has been left out of this listing to keep the length down, but can easily be written in to give a brief description of the operation of the controls before the game starts. It finishes off by saying this program has also been successfully run using joysticks on the Model B, and lines 550 to 570 have to be altered if you want to use joysticks instead of the keyboard. So that's an interesting touch. In 1982, I'm surprised joysticks were even commonplace enough for anyone to actually want to test something with them. So before we take a look at the game, let's now have a look at the listing itself, and you can see it's not very big listing. Again, it only fills 2 columns on half a page or so, so pretty decent in terms of not having to type a lot in. So as it mentioned, this one uses a lot of procedures, and you can see right at the beginning here it calls proc init for initialization, proc title for the titles, proc ship to draw the ship, and so on, and then it goes through a cycle of B equaling 1 to 5 and then calls the game. So that's interesting because that cycle is the number of Tarragons that you've got to shoot down. That's where it mentioned you can increase that number there, but it's interesting that what it does is call a procedure 5 times over to actually play the game. So moving down, you can see that proc game is defined there. There's a number of coordinates and things like that defined by the looks of it, and then it does proc move, which we'll have a look at in a moment, but I imagine that's to move the ship around or something like that. Then there's also proc ship, which looks like it draws the ship on the screen. There's a lot of proc fill commands, so we'll have to have a look at what that does as well, but each call to proc fill is passing in some values, numbers, and also pi divided by 36 on that particular call there, and pi divided by 6 on another one, so it's doing some stuff with pi, which suggests it's probably doing something with circles or curves. You can see here it's printed to the screen the score, the number of hits, and the record, again as was referred to in the introduction to the game. Here's the definition for proc fill, so it's definitely doing some G-col, which is graphical color settings, plotting 85, it mentioned that as well, so basically plotting graphics on the screen. So rather than drawing sprites on the screen, this one's actually plotting graphical shapes, so that'll be interesting to see how that comes out when we look at the game. There's a definition for proc bird here, which is moving the enemies around, I suspect, and also doing more plot commands. There's the call to proc move, which has also got sound effects being played, graphical settings with that VDU setting there, and also some changes to the X and Y coordinates as suspected that were used earlier on. Proc move is followed by a definition of proc fire, which is obviously you firing your weapon, and again the sound effects related to that. And then it goes on to have proc hit, which is when you're hitting an enemy, I imagine. Proc chase, I'm not quite sure what's going on there, but there's lots of X and Y coordinates changed there. Proc rules was the one that was mentioned that's been left out for you to put your own instructions in if you want to. There's a definition for proc init, which is just the initialization of the game. Proc title is just drawing Tarragon and the copyright information on the screen there. And proc score is obviously calculating your score. And proc end finishes the game and asks you if you want another one. So I think that'll do for looking through the listing. I think you can tell it's quite efficiently written, and definitely the fact that it's using these graphical plot commands rather than just drawing stuff on the screen with characters should make it an interesting one to look at. So let's take a look at it. Upon loading the game up, I'm presented with some instructions, which clearly means that the person who typed this game in for the BBC Micro Games archive spent the time padding out that proc rules procedure. So the first page of the instructions is very much a copy of the text from the magazine, and then it skips on to a second page which says shoot down the 5 Tarragons as quickly as possible using the following keys. They're listed there. Time penalties for missing, and the fastest time earns the record score. And then it says press spacebar to begin your mission. As you can probably guess, that's what I did. So basic title screen is displayed very briefly with the name of the game and the author, and then it draws the cockpit for this game, because this game is quite impressive compared to the ones we saw in the first episode, because it's a first person cockpit shooter. So using those clever graphical plotting commands, it draws the cockpit on the screen along with the score display at the bottom and a crosshairs in the middle of the screen, and then the first of 5 Tarragons that you have to destroy makes its way onto the screen flapping around. So the idea of the game is you've got to eliminate these 5 Tarragons in as quick a time as possible, and you use the keys to manoeuvre the crosshairs towards the Tarragon, and when you get it in your sights you fire the laser. The red areas of the screen are turned to pink and you fire lasers at the enemy. When the lasers fire, there's a pretty nice sound, and there's also a decent explosion noise when you do finally hit a Tarragon. If you don't manage to keep the Tarragon in your sights, eventually it will drift off the screen, and then effectively you lose that chance to hit that one and you're issued with a time penalty. Once you've eliminated all 5 Tarragons, the game is over, and if you've managed to eliminate them all and score less than the current record score, then you set the new record. So I have to say this is a very nice looking game. It is quite short lived, but as was mentioned in the magazine listing, you can change the number of Tarragons to destroy for each game. I'd imagine one of the things you'd probably want to do if you're going to enhance this game is to give it some different difficulty levels with the number of Tarragons being adjusted for each one. Using the graphical plotting functions means the game moves quite smoothly, although the Tarragon itself is quite flickery. It's quite impressive how the enemy disappears behind the frame of your cockpit, but I do find it a strange decision to make the playfield cyan rather than having it the typical black of Deep Space and make the frame either cyan or white. As you'll see from some of this footage, it is quite hard to hit the Tarragons. You have to get them dead centre in the sights to destroy them, so perhaps a little bit of work on the collision detection would improve the game slightly. Perhaps another thing you could do is flip things around with regard to the scoring. Instead of trying to get a lower score, you could perhaps try and get a high one by scoring points for shooting the Tarragons and losing lives when one escapes. Overall though, I have to say this is a pretty impressive game for 1982, considering it's a type-in listing that doesn't even take up a full page in the magazine. It may be short-lived, but it's also quite addictive, so I think it would have been worth typing the game in, and it's definitely got the scope for creating a game with more longevity. If I'd bought this issue of Popular Computing Weekly back then and typed this game in, I think it'd have been 35p well spent. For the second game and publication of this episode, we're sticking in September and in fact just moving 2 weeks on to the 23rd of September 1982 edition of Popular Computing Weekly. Once again, you can see it's got a nice vibrant cover there with King Kong sat on the top of a building. If you look closely though, the building's actually got the keyboard of a computer on it, so that's quite neat. He's grasping a woman in one hand and a plane in the other, so you can probably guess that the featured game, as it says on the cover story here, Kong's Revenge on the Spectrum, so not a BBC Micro game this time as the main game featured in the magazine, but it is a Spectrum game and it's going to be somewhat related to King Kong or Donkey Kong, I imagine. The other notable thing on the front cover here that it says is Spectrum software, is it worth buying? Well, I'd presume some of it was. So let's move on and have a look at, we're going to skip past the contents for this one and go to the news desk, page 5. Bottom right hand corner here is quite an interesting story that I noticed. The headline there is "Move over Jaws, E.T. is on your trail." Let's just zoom in and look at that a little bit more closely. It says Atari has signed a deal with MCA to produce a series of computer games based on the theme of Steven Spielberg's new billion-dollar film E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Well, I think we all know how that turned out, so let's move on from that. Quite an interesting story. Interesting to see how excited people were about it before the game came out. So moving on. Skip past the letters page. Oh, that's the main game there, Kong's Revenge. As you can see, very much seems to be a Donkey Kong inspired game based on the layout of platforms, ladders and barrels there, but that's for the Spectrum, so we're not really interested in that. There's also an article here, or at the beginning of a series about machine code. It says at the top there, a new series for beginners. It's beginning to talk you about machine code, so if basic wasn't good enough for you, then you could start learning machine code with this series, presumably printed from one issue to the next because there's only the one page of it here. And there's not too much more of interest in this particular magazine other than the games listing, so let's move on to that. It is part of this open forum where readers can send in their own listings for games and other programs, so there's a lot of different ones in there, but I'm going to move on straight away to this one, which is on page 20, Canyon on the BBC Micro. Let's zoom in and take a closer look at this. So it says Canyon was developed on the BBC Model B. It has been compressed to run on the Model A. There's a lot of information there about how you get it to run on your Model A if you want to. The program was developed from Roadrunner by Tim Hartnell, as published in Popular Computing Weekly April the 20th, 1982. Substantial modifications and enhancements have been made. It then goes on to give an overview of what the game's about, and this is going to be one of those games that's very familiar to people who typed in games early in the 80s. It moved past the explanation of the game onto the description of what the program does, and you can see here it mentions line number 1, if escape is pressed, go to average routine. No idea. Got the instructions, initialization, main program section, crash routine, top 10 scores update and display routine, so it's got a high score table in it, and display average and reset routine. And then goes on to talk about someone, I assume this is the person that sent the listing in, saying they've got bored waiting for the BBC word processor chip, and as a stopgap measure have written a 3-line word processor for the Epson MX80 printer, which they keep under the bit of plastic guarded by the BBC Owl. So there you go, if you wanted a very basic word processing thing, I assume that's basically to process it so it'll actually go output to the printer, but it's not entirely clear what that's all about. And then it goes on to the listing, and well, good luck to you if you could read this one, even when you had the original magazine, but the scan of it is particularly blurry. So some of the listing's quite easy to read. You can quite clearly see lines 24 to 46 there, but the first part is absolutely tiny. So I will zoom in again to try and see something, but I don't think we're going to get much joy here. So yeah, I can't make that out at all, but basically that's the game listing. The guys decided to do the line numbering literally like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 with no gaps in between, so there's not much margin for like adding new stuff to this particular one either. So zooming back out, you can see the lower part of the listing quite clearly, and perhaps the most interesting thing to note out of this is the fact that it's got this high score table. You can see here the print commands for telling you you've got your score in the top 10 and to type your name in, but what's most interesting is it uses an array. You can see there's an array called SC, which is the array of scores, and also a string array, N string. So that's the scores and the names basically, and it loops through that to print them out on the screen and also work out your position within the array. So that's quite a cool thing to see, not seeing any arrays until this point. So there you go, it also records your average distance travelled, and you can also reset the values with some various other things put in there. But yeah, unfortunately not much of the listing to be able to see on this one because of how small it was printed, so let's move on and take a look at the game instead. So as is pretty customary by now, we get some instructions when the game loads up. You can see this is just a repeat of the text that was in the magazine. The fleet is totally surrounded. There's only one chance: someone must make it through the canyon to find reinforcements. Only a madman would venture through the narrow and treacherous canyon, blah blah blah. Use the cursor control keys to move left and right and the space bar to energise your laser. At the bottom there it says press any key to continue. It's now switched to mode 2, which the game runs in, and you get more instructions. Basically just the same information as you've seen on the previous page, which makes me wonder whether that first instructions page was actually in the original listing in the magazine. The game then begins, and you can see it's one of these games. As I said, it's a very tried and tested early typing game. Basically it's move your player sprite, whatever it is, through the randomly generated canyon or racetrack or whatever they've decided to make it, and try not to crash into the walls and get as far as possible, and you get a score when you're finished. This version of the game does also add the ability to shoot the mines, so the little yellow dots are mines. If you crash into them you die, and you can shoot them with the laser. It's a very simplistic game but quite well implemented. Obviously you've got the random generation of the canyon that you're flying through. That can be a bit hit and miss, and sometimes you do get into positions where you can't get around some of the edges. It's also quite jerky as it's generating the top line each time. You can see it flickers quite a bit, and also the same at the bottom when the bottom line goes off the screen. But despite that, it moves fairly smoothly, I would say. You do get some sound effects as well. You've got the noise of you travelling down the canyon, the explosion when you crash into mines or the wall, and also the sound of your laser as it fires. As you'd expect, the graphics are quite simplistic. It's basically just blocks, but the sprite for your ship is quite nicely drawn. When you inevitably crash, you get a score based on how far you've managed to travel through the canyon, and I presume you also get bonus points for shooting the mines. You're told at the top of the screen how far you've travelled and how many mines you've zapped, and then you get to put your name in the high score table if it's within the top 10 best scores. One thing you'll notice on the video is that every time I fire the laser, the game slows down slightly. That does actually give you advantage at certain points, as you can use it to give you a split-second chance to manoeuvre around things. It's not particularly great programming, I guess that's just the limitations of a basic program mean that it needs to take just a split second to register when you're firing a shot. There's not really a lot you could do to improve this one, to be honest. All you could really do is try and smooth out the generation of the canyon at the top and bottom there to make it a bit less flickery. I've only really included this one because it's just one of those simple games that everyone typed in back in the day. It's probably one of the first games a lot of people typed in. It seems to be a reasonably decent version of that type of game, but really doesn't offer a great deal of fun for more than a couple of minutes. Having said that, again, it's not a particularly long listing to type in. It does offer something that other listings we've looked at so far didn't, which is the use of an array for the high score table, so perhaps there's some value in it for that reason alone. For the next game, let's move on to November 1982 and Acorn User magazine. This is the official magazine of Acorn Computers, but they were a little bit late to the party because the first edition of this magazine wasn't launched until July 1982. Generally speaking, the magazine was quite serious and didn't always feature games listings, but in this one a game has taken centre stage as it's featured on the front cover here. Trek 3, the space war game, starting on page 15 it says there. And the other notable thing on the front cover here is you can win a BBC Micro by turning to page 71. So let's move inside. I'm not going to focus too much on the articles in this one. As I said, it is quite serious and I like to focus more on things that are about games, generally speaking. There's a big advert for the Acorn Atom here, which was the predecessor to the BBC Micro. As you can see, it looks very similar, but it was nowhere near as popular, certainly a more niche computer compared to the one that followed it. So let's move on. There's an article here about Acorn and Disney linking up. It sounds quite exciting, but actually it's just a competition based on the fact that Tron was released, and you could win a BBC Micro, I think, by writing a story about Tron or something like that. Let's move on. And the first interesting news article is that the Acorn Electron launch has been delayed. The Electron will not be available before the end of the year. That's the disappointing news from Acorn, and it goes on to tell you why. And it's a similar story to the problems when they were producing the BBC Micro. The ULA not ready for main production, so the project has been rescheduled for spring. So I'm going to skim quickly through a few pages here. We're going to go to page 18 next, and this was the introduction of the Programmers Forum conducted by Ian Birnbaum. The chance for readers to earn up to £20 by providing original hints and tips. Coping with break is the subject of this month's column. I'm not going to cover this in any kind of depth. I just wanted to point it out that if you were a BBC Micro programmer, you could get hints and tips in this feature each month in the Acorn User magazine. So I'm not going to skip on quite a long way through because I don't want to spend too much time looking at this magazine. I'm going to go to page 66 eventually, and the letters page, and there's a couple of interesting letters that I noticed here. The first one's this one, which is a bit sad. Computer theft in the night. This is from Paul Roger Bishop in Kent, who says, "Sir, could you find room to tell readers that my BBC Micro was stolen? It disappeared during the night along with other goods when thieves broke into my home. If anyone knows of its whereabouts, could they contact their local police or let me know through the magazine? To lose the computer when I had it only 4 weeks is most upsetting. I was just beginning to enjoy it." Well, poor Roger, I wonder if he ever got that back. The second noteworthy thing on this letters page isn't actually a letter at all, but it's entitled Buzz Off. Readers who are fed up with a buzzing BBC Micro can solve the irritation by connecting resistor to IC20 as shown above. This chip is found on the main board near the front of the Micro under the keyboard. This alteration is only recommended for people who are used to working with electronics, as it will invalidate Acorn's guarantee. Dealers can also make this change. So yeah, if you've got a buzzing BBC Micro, there's the solution. So skipping through the rest of the magazine quite quickly, I don't think there's too much of great note there to point out, but I wanted to go to the back page and point out this advert from Program Power and Micro Power. I did mention this in the first episode of this series, that I would be showing their adverts. They've already become more vibrant. The first one was quite bland looking, but this one's a lot more vibrant, and they do get even better. But this is an advert for Alien Destroyers, only $6.95. So that was a quick flick through this issue of Acorn User. Let's now get on to the game listing. And here it is on page 19, not page 15 as it said on the front of the magazine. And you can see the game is called Trek 3, A Starship's Last Stand. No prizes for guessing what this is influenced by. In a far-flung galaxy on the uncharted edge of Earth's decaying empire, a lone starship fights a losing battle as it stalks its prey, the Klingons. Okay, so yeah, no prizes whatsoever for guessing what this is inspired by. The enemy ships are lying dormant, waiting for the Earth ship to come within range. Then they pounce, and the battle-weary humans can only take so much. Their precious energy dwindles with every move, and each encounter saps the starship's strength. But the Klingons can be beaten. Supplies are available from star bases, so they are few and far between, and their positions unknown. So it'll take careful planning and every last ounce of the starship commander's cunning to win. So there's a couple of screenshots there, nothing much to say there, it's just some text on a screen. And then there's a massive load of information about how to play the game, which I'm not going to go through here because I'll mention it briefly when we look at the game itself. So let's move on to the listing, and this is a biggie compared to the ones we've looked at so far. It covers several pages and I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail. What I will say, it's actually 4 pages and about 250 lines I think. What I will say is, why have they done it on this weird sort of slightly angled view? I don't really understand why that would be beneficial in any way. It just seems like it would be annoying when you're trying to read through the listing and type it in. So in terms of the content, it's a lot of procedures very similar to things we've already looked at, so again, not going to go into too much detail on it. There's a lot of text printed on the screen as well in terms of the instructions and things like that. So I'll try and pick out anything that's particularly noteworthy. I mean, this is the main core of the program here, and there's lots of procedures. As I've said, there's def proc Klingon there, there's proc phasers, there's proc base. You can get the idea here. Basically, you're going to be moving around an area, trying to engage with Klingons, firing your phasers, docking with bases and things like that. There's also proc shield, because your shields are going to get diminished. You can see some calculations going on in that one, for example. I don't really see a lot of point in going into too much detail of the listing because it's quite an in-depth program and I don't really want to be picking through every line, pointing out various bits and pieces. So I think we'll leave it at that, other than to say there's also a galactic record at the end there. Lots of text printed on the screen, as I've said, including things like "You fool, you ran out of fuel," and "Starbase Command awards you some points," there it says, and "You exterminated all the Klingons." So lots of interesting stuff to print on the screen if you get far enough into the game. So that's enough of looking at the listing for this one. Let's take a look at the game, which is, as you can probably guess, quite an in-depth one compared to the ones we've looked at so far. Upon loading up the game, you're presented with the first of several pages of instructions, beginning with the backstory for the game as was described in the magazine. It then moves on to tell you that your job as Starship Commander is to destroy all 15 Klingons using as little time and energy as possible, and your initial energy level dictates the level of difficulty. It goes on to give you some information about how to move your starship around and tells you that you're going to be working in an 8x8 sector of space. Further instructions then tell you about the different screens that you're going to be seeing in the game, including the Navcom and the ArmCon. The 4th page has more information along these lines with different numbers that you can press to access different areas of the game. There's a page that gives you information about using your shields and what impact the enemy fire can have on them, and also that you're able to fire photon torpedoes and phasers, and that they have to be aimed and fired in one of 4 directions by pressing numbers on the keyboard. and after a final page of instructions you finally get into the game, where you have to input your difficulty level. The higher number you enter, the easier it is. The game then starts and you're shown a simplistic view of your starship in a sector of space. The idea of the game is to patrol an area of the galaxy made up of a grid of 8x8 sectors. You can see which sector you're in on the right hand side of the screen, along with the current status, shield level, the amount of energy you have remaining, and the amount of time you've spent in the game so far. You also get a status report at the bottom of the screen. The whole game is done in mode 7, so that means there's no fancy graphics, and the representation of your starship on the screen is simply a little yellow arrow. As mentioned in the instructions, you're able to access a number of other screens. The first of those is the navigation computer, which gives you several options, including returning to the screen you've just been on, looking at your cumulative galaxy record, the starbase data, and accessing the armaments computer. This screen also tells you your current energy level and what quadrant you're in. Accessing the galactic record shows you an overview of the area that you're patrolling. As I mentioned, it's an 8x8 grid, and each uninvestigated sector is represented by 3 green blocks. Any sector you've visited is represented by a sequence of 3 numbers. The first of these tells you how many Klingons are in the area, the second tells you how many stars there are, and the third tells you if there's any star bases. Accessing the armaments computer gives you an overview of how many photon torpedoes you have remaining, your current shield level, the number of Klingons still left to be destroyed, and gives you the options for firing photon torpedoes, resetting your shields, or switching back to one of the other screens. At any point you can access this screen to increase your shield level. This obviously uses up some energy. So moving back to the short range scanner screen, you use the cursor keys to manoeuvre your starship around, exploring the sectors looking for things of interest. The aim of the game is to hunt down and eliminate all 15 Klingons. When you encounter a Klingon, it'll be represented as a red arrow on the screen and immediately start attacking you, initially draining your shields and then if they run out, your energy. It can also cause damage to your navigation or armaments computers. To destroy a Klingon you have 2 options. You can either enter the armaments computer and fire a photon torpedo, which will immediately destroy it, or you can engage at short range with your phasers. You only have a limited number of photon torpedoes, so ultimately you're going to have to engage your enemies at short range at some point in the game. If either of your computers are damaged in combat, they automatically repair themselves after a short period of time once you're in a safe area. As your energy is obviously depleted and can also be impacted by encounters with the Klingons, you'll need to find star bases to replenish it at certain times. These are represented by a white @ symbol on the screen, and you just need to dock with them to start restoring your energy. Unfortunately, there seems to be a bug with this implementation of the game, because when I've docked with the starship, what seems to happen is the game resets itself rather than restoring any energy. I'm assuming that's a problem with the docking procedure in the listing. It might have been a mistake by the person that typed the listing in, or it's possibly a bug in the listing printed in the magazine, which may have been corrected in a later issue. I also noticed the occasional glitches, such as characters suddenly disappearing off the short range scanner and the shield display sometimes being inaccurate too. Putting those issues aside though, and assuming they could quite easily be fixed, this is quite a deep and involving game considering it's just a basic listing. I found myself getting quite invested in navigating around the sectors and engaging with the Klingons, and there's definitely a sense of panic when you do encounter one as the status goes red and a warning alert is sounded. With elements of strategy and resource management, this is a big step up from the simple arcade games we've looked at so far. In terms of improvements that could be made to the programme, the obvious thing that stands out is the graphics. While most of the status and computer screens should be kept in mode 7, I feel like switching the short range scanner to another mode so that you could represent the starship, stars, bases and Klingons with nice little custom designed graphical characters would have been a nice touch. The other main change I'd probably make to the game is to improve the keyboard controls. Moving around with the cursor keys is fine, but using 1, 2, 3 and 4 to fire your phases is not very intuitive. Interestingly, the author of the game, Tim Heaton, did make improvements to the game, including those keyboard controls, as it was released commercially a year later by Acorn User with many enhancements under the name Trek, though it still ran completely in mode 7. The irony is, of course, with the entire game listing to hand, you could make most of those enhancements yourself if you wanted to. Overall, I think Trek 3 is the most interesting game I've covered so far. It is a very long listing, but as long as you knew what you were getting before you typed it in, and fixed those bugs if they were printed in the magazine, I think this is one game you could really invest some time into. For the next game, we're going back to a publication that was featured in episode 1 of this series, which is the Beeb newsletter. As you can see, this is volume 1, number 8 from December 1982. Now, unlike most of the magazines I'm looking at, there wasn't a copy of this available on archive.org, so I had to download a PDF version of this from a website that's got scans of almost all the copies of Beeb. I'll put a link to that website in the pinned comment. Now, the cover of this issue was a nice bright red colour, but unfortunately this scan is only in black and white, hence why you're just seeing a rather dingy grey looking version. Just like the first issue that we looked at, the contents of the newsletter are on the front cover, and you can see that there's quite a lot in there. It's got 44 pages in this edition compared to about 30 in the first one. And you can see at the bottom there it says the membership of the user group now exceeds 12,000, so that's quite impressive for the first year of life of the BBC Micro, I would say. In terms of what this edition contains, there's a number of articles covering a variety of subjects, including software and book reviews. There's a number of programs, as you'd expect, including a couple of games, Breakout and Space City, which is the one we're going to be looking at in more detail. And also there's some hints and tips about programming and utilising your BBC Micro in a variety of ways. So I'm not going to delve into this one in too much detail, but let's move on to the inside front cover where there's an advert for a Beeb software manager. They require a full-time software manager to be based in St Albans to run Beeb Soft. Duties will range from the evaluation and editing of programs for the software library to the organisation of their distribution and promotion. Applicants should have adequate programming experience and a good familiarity with the BBC Micro. So to apply, you have to provide a CV and the names of 2 referees, which is quite substantial for a job like this, I would think, because I'm assuming it wasn't full-time. And this sounds like it could have been quite an interesting job, but unfortunately applications closed on the 15th of January 1983, so I'm a little bit too late for that one. So there's a number of quite techy articles in this one, including retrieving a bad program, which I'm not going to spend any time looking at. There's a review of the disk system, and again I'm not going to go into too much detail of this. Obviously disk drives are quite popular with BBC Micro users, more serious enthusiasts of computing, so without dwelling on this too much, let's just have a look at the price that a disk drive might cost you at this point in time. You can see they evaluated several drives, the first of which was a BBC disk drive at a cost of £265 for a single drive. There was also a Microware Type ZL141B, which cost £155 for a single drive. A Microage BBC compatible single disc drive with a price of £235, although you could get a 5% discount for Beeb members. And then there are 2 even more expensive ones, which are the Microage BBC Slimline dual disc drive, which costs £799, and the Microware Type ZL292, which was £661 for a double disc drive. So when you think that a BBC Micro itself cost over £300, if you wanted to set up a Beeb with a disk system, you've got to outlay some serious money at this point in time. So I'm going to skim through the rest of the magazine fairly quickly. There's some adverts, there are various other programs and utilities, BBC Basics and talking about hexadecimal and things like that. Procedure and function library for filled circle drawing. Again, that's another short program. And then we get onto the software reviews where there's a couple of games reviewed. Firstly, there's Fun Games from the BBC, which cost £10 and consisted of 4 games, but the one that stood out more to me was Monsters from Acorn Soft, with a retail price at that point of £9.95. This is a game I remember playing quite a lot in the early days of having a Beeb, and it's a clone of the arcade game Space Panic if you didn't know. The idea of the game is to dig holes for the monsters to drop in and then fill them in. And the issue I had with the game is much the same as is described here by the reviewer, which is that using the D and F keys to dig and fill the holes made it really difficult to move around because you had to take your hand off either the up or down or the left or right, which meant a monster might catch you while you were doing it. The reviewer also mentions that the price of £9.95 is quite high. There's also a review here of WordWise, the word processor, which I remember we had on our BBC Micro back in the day as well. There's not a huge amount of other stuff in this particular issue that I found noteworthy, so I'm going to move on to the game listings, which is towards the back. Firstly, there's a listing for Breakout, which I already covered a version of in the first episode of the series, so I'm not going to be looking at that. We're going to move on to the second listing, which is Space City. And as you can see, it's a 16K game by J Banks, and it's been tested on versions 0.1 and 1.1 OS. The description of the game says this is an ingenious little program using 4 colours in mode 5. It will run on a 16K machine even with full instructions. Invading aliens spring from a hovering craft and descend by random steps onto the unprotected city. You control the customary laser base, but it differs from the usual variety in that you can control the lateral position of the laser bolt in mid-flight. Extra use of this facility makes it just possible to prevent a successful attack on the city by the first fleet. The second fleet, however, soon arrive and they move even faster. There's on-screen scoring and full instructions are given in the program, and it goes on to say if you wish to change the colours you should experiment with line 110 and see the user guide for details of how to use the VDU19 call. Now what I really like about this listing is it goes into lots of detail about what all the procedures are called and what they do, and even what all the variables are and what they're for. There's also a screenshot of the game which looks quite impressive from this small black and white picture. So just to quickly skim through what the procedures are, there's a procedure called City that draws the city in a given colour, Inv moves the aliens around, Base enables the gun base to be moved left and right and also initiates the firing of a missile, MSL moves the missile and checks to see if it's hit an alien, and Hit, if an alien has been hit, then it checks to see which one, adjusts the score and resets certain coordinates. And in terms of the variables used, obviously you can see there's quite a lot of them based on this list, but ones that stand out, or it looks like they're using arrays for the invader's coordinates, so a coordinate X and Y for each invader, missile coordinates, invader type to be printed on the screen, which suggests there's different types of enemy, the height of the invaders shot from the mothership, score, and then there's lots of other ones. I'm not going to go through them all. Loop counters, also keyboard scans and testing for whether an enemy's hit. But let's move on to the listing itself, and you can see at the beginning here it's quite obviously got the instructions printed out on the screen. It then does some VDU commands which are setting up the character sprites, as we've seen in other listings already. One thing that's interesting here is there's a section here where it starts to draw the city, proc city there, where it's doing something with pi, and I think we can probably guess that that's this circle here. It's going to draw this circle on the screen, so that's quite a cool thing it's doing to do that. Moving on to the next page is the rest of the listing. As you can see, once again, it's a pretty short one at 75 lines. You can see lots of calls to the procedures here. There's a repeat here that's doing proc base, proc inv, proc base. So that's probably the main program loop there, moving the base and moving the invaders. Line 250 there is printing the score on the screen. You can see SC% there, and until E% equals 1 or C% equals 20, you can see that the person that wrote this was not a fan of spaces where they weren't needed. That's probably to save memory. So if we're to look back at the variables, E% is the end game indicator. So yeah, what this is doing, as I suspected, is it's repeating between line 210 and 260, just running these procedures over and over again, and that's basically the game logic. Next at line 320 you can see the procedure for creating the city. That's for creating the buildings rather than that arc over them, I think. It then moves on to the definition of proc inv, which includes some generation of random numbers, presumably to place the invaders on the screen in random locations. There's a whole string of if statements that are looking at those random numbers that have just been generated, and also a sound is generated. I think that's moving the invaders around. It then moves on to define proc base, which is the movement of your base, and it's got some in-key commands there for the movement left and right and also firing. It then goes on to define the procedure for firing the missiles, and you can see there that MY is being changed, and that was the Y coordinates for the missile. There's also a test there for if P% equals 1 or P% equals 3, then it goes to proc hit, so that's detecting whether a missile is actually hitting an enemy. And finally, proc hit is defined, and amongst there you can see a sound command, so that's going to be an explosion. There's also some VDU commands, so I suspect it does something graphically to the screen when you do hit an enemy. So that's about it for the listing. Again, it's a pretty short one, as I mentioned, only 75 lines, so pretty easy to type in. There's a lot going on some of those lines, and not all of it's really easy to decipher, but I think because it gives you a definition of all the procedures and the variables as well quite clearly, you can pick your way through it and work out what's going on, so if you wanted to make changes it wouldn't be too difficult. So just before we look at the game, let's just finish off looking through the last few pages of this edition of Beeb magazine. And what stood out to me, there's one other program in here that would have been quite interesting to type in back in the day. It's not a game, but it's an art program, so you can see a couple of screenshots of things created by this. This looks pretty powerful from the two screenshots, and it's not a particularly long listing. I mean, it starts there on page 39, goes to page 40 and 41, but I think if you wanted to create an art program that does quite a few different things, that looked quite decent. And then finally, just to round things off, there's some discounts that are available to Beeb members, another couple of adverts, and on the back cover some more information about writing to the magazine and things like that. So that's pretty much it for this edition of Beeb. Let's now take a look at that game Space City. So no surprise here, you get some instructions which are considerably more simple than the last game we looked at. Save Space City by stopping the invaders from landing. ZNext move your missile left and right and return key launches it, and the higher you hit the invaders the more you score, so there's obviously some kind of randomization with the scoring depending on how high up the invaders are when you hit them. So nothing fancy about the instructions there. I think they were kept nice and simple because the guy who wrote this program wanted it to fit in 16K. So once you start the game, it draws the city on the screen. You can see this is quite nicely done. You've got the cityscape at the bottom with the nice arc over the top of it. I guess it's supposed to be some kind of futuristic dome that the city's protected by, although that's not going very well based on what happens next, because then a bunch of invaders appear from the mothership on the end of these yellow lines that it's drawn across the screen, and they randomly make their way down the screen and you've got to fend them off. Now interestingly, you don't actually have a base at the bottom of the screen. Your missile, which looks like an exclamation mark, just kind of hovers around and you move it left and right, and then when you fire it you can also move it left and right as it goes up the screen. So I think one obvious enhancement that you could make to the game is to add a base at the bottom so you're actually firing the missile from something. So it's a fairly straightforward Space Invaders variant. The invaders come down the screen and if one of them touches the cityscape then it's game over. You only get one life in this one, but again that's something you could possibly tweak if you wanted to play around with the code. There's two types of enemy, although they don't really do anything very different. It's just that the typical Space Invader looking enemies start lower down the screen, whereas the ones that resemble something that comes from a game like Galaxian or Phoenix start higher up. There's no animation on the enemies and it'd be too much to expect that, to be honest, but they move down the screen quite nicely with no flickering, and it all moves pretty quickly considering it's written in BASIC. In addition to the quite nice graphics, you've got some sound effects. There's a kind of warbling sound as the enemies make their way down the screen, and there's also a pretty unsatisfactory buzz when you hit one. So perhaps improving the sound is another aspect you could work on if you wanted to play around with the code. I did notice there's a small bug in the game where if one of the invaders goes to the very left hand side of the screen, you can't actually shoot them because your missile won't go that far across, so that's a little bit annoying, but it's probably quite easy to fix if you dig into the code. Being able to move the missile in flight is an interesting touch, and it does take some getting used to, as I found myself moving my invisible base left to right trying to zero in on the next enemy and missing the one I intended to hit with the missile I just fired. Once you get used to it though, it's actually quite neat. Each time you clear a level, the next wave of enemies appears further down the screen, just like in Space Invaders, which makes the game all the more frantic as you progress. I must say I was pretty impressed with this one. It's a very playable variant on a well-known arcade game theme, and the visuals are pretty impressive for 1982. If you were to add in some of the enhancements I've already suggested, and also things like a high score table and perhaps varying the landscape of the city from one level to the next, this almost reaches the standards of a commercial game for the time, but even without those enhancements it's well worth the time it would have taken to type in those 75 lines of code. For the final listing of this episode and rounding out my look at 1982, we're moving on to a rather battered looking copy of Your Computer magazine from December 1982. Describing itself as Britain's biggest selling home computer magazine. I have no idea if that was actually true or not, and the thing that really stands out to me on this, other than the very vibrant front colour with the yellow and green, is that it says it's got free ZX81, Spectrum and VIC-20 FlexiDisc games, and I think you can see with the tear marks here at the top and then again at the bottom, there was obviously a FlexiDisc attached to this. If you're not quite sure what a FlexiDisc was, then Google it, but basically it was a very thin plastic vinyl record, effectively, not actually made of vinyl but made of plastic, with the record grooves cut into one side of it. So yeah, it seems like there were 3 games not on a cover tape but actually a cover flexi-disc, so we'll dig into this issue to look into that a little bit more. The other thing it mentions is, and there's obviously a flight simulator theme to this because there's a kind of a pilot there, but pilot's helmet, you can see his chin at the bottom there and a readout on his visor, but it says there's Top Flight, Atari, Atom, BBC, Dragon, MZ80K, VIC, Spectrum and ZX81 games, so I don't know if there's going to be a focus on flight simulators in this one. This edition of Your Computer's got over 160 pages, so I'm not going to delve too deeply into it other than looking at more about that flexi-disc. What I am going to do is focus on a bunch of adverts, because this magazine, coming out just before Christmas, is packed with loads of adverts for the different computers that were available at the end of 1982. So let's start by looking inside the first few pages, and after a few pages we'll see an advert for the Jupiter Ace, which was mentioned earlier in this episode. This is a different advert to the one I showed earlier, but it's got the same kind of information. Just a couple of pages on and we get an advert for the Auric One, the Computer Challenge, 16 colours, professional keyboard, full graphics and real sound, as opposed to what sound? And moving just a couple of pages on from that is an advert for the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, which had been released earlier in the year, of course. 16 or 48k RAM, full-size moving key keyboard, sort of, colour and sound, high resolution graphics from only £125. You can also see information there about the ZX printer available now and the ZX microdrive coming soon. Skipping just a couple of pages on, and there's a news article here with the first glimpse of Acorn's Electron, the 32k £150 Spectrum rival. So let's just zoom in and take a closer look at that. It's effectively a continuation of the story that I already covered coming from Acorn User earlier in this episode. Acorn's eagerly awaited Electron has joined the select band of microcomputers which are already late before they're even officially launched. It goes on to talk about the familiar ULA problems that have haunted Acorn in the past, and says that Acorn hoped to launch the machine early in the new year. So let's move on a few more pages, because coming up is more information about that flexi-disc. Here it is. You can see pictures of the Spectrum, ZX81 and VIC-20 there, representing the 3 computers that have games on this flexi-disc. Let's zoom in and find out a little bit more about this, because I'm intrigued by this. So without reading through the whole article, it states here that this isn't the first of the Your Computer flexi discs. There have been ones in previous issues. The second revelation concerned people could not get the flexi disc to load. Often they'd not read the instructions. Well, fair enough then. It goes on to tell you what games are actually on this one. So firstly, there's a ZX81 adventure game based on the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And the other two programs it mentions towards the end there, the Spectrum program loads in two halves and is called Night Racer, and the VIC program is called Anti-Space 2. And it concludes the main article by saying, be prepared to spend some time loading the tapes. It's doubtful that you'll get everything right first go. So what it suggests is you can either load the games directly from the flexi disc by plugging your record player into your computer, or record the games from the record player onto a tape and then load them from the tape. And it goes into more detail about how to do that in this box out here. The key bit of information to pick out from this box out is to remember that the speed of the flexi disc is 33 RPM. If you didn't put it at the right speed and tried to record it at 45 RPM, you were never going to get that game to load. There's also lots of information about how to load the games once you've recorded them to the tape, or to load them from the flexi disc, and also some suggestions that you should try and do everything in mono if possible. So yeah, that's absolutely intriguing. I was not aware that flexi discs were provided to have games on them. If you ever loaded a game from a flexi disc onto your computer and played one, then let me know in the comments, because I'm intrigued to know how well that worked. So let's carry on working through this magazine. I'm clearly not going to skip through every page. I'm going to skip past large sections of it. But on the very next page, there's a review of the Sword M5, another computer released in 1982. There were so many varied computers that were released, and a lot of them weren't successful whatsoever. They were pretty much gone a year or two later. But yeah, if you had a Sword M5, let me know in the comments, because again, I don't know anyone who ever had one of those. Moving on to page 32, and here's an interesting advert from Llamasoft. Two 100% machine code arcade games for the unexpanded VIC-20, only £6 each, including Grid Runner and Abductor. We all know about Llamasoft, of course, very popular games from the early 80s, programmed by Jeff Minter. There's even a picture of a llama in the bottom left corner there. Now moving towards the latter pages of the magazine, and here's another advert, this time for the Dragon 32, and this one's quite interesting because it's got a product comparison. So at the top right there, it's comparing the Dragon 32, Spectrum, Acorn Atom, VIC-20, the Texas Instruments computer, and also the BBC Micro Model A. Notably not the Model B, because that would make the Dragon look quite bad in comparison, I suspect. Just got a couple more adverts I want to show you that I thought were quite interesting. Firstly, on this page here, which is 135, you've got Andrew Hewson's books for the Spectrum, 20 best programs for the Spectrum, and also 40 best machine code routines for the Spectrum. So this is one of the early adverts for Hewson Consultants, who of course went on to become a major games publisher for the likes of the Spectrum, Amstrad and Commodore 64, publishing games such as Cybernoid, Nebulous and Uridium. And if I skip just a few pages on from there, there's an advert I want to look at just to round this off before we look at the games listing. And that is this one here, bottom left hand side on this page, top quality machine code programs for the BBC microcomputer from Superior Software. Now this advert very strangely looks like some of the writing's been handwritten, but yeah, there's adverts for Galaxians, Invaders, Space Fighter and Centipede, four of the early games from Superior Software, who of course were the biggest and most popular publisher of games for the BBC Micro. There's also a bunch of other BBC Micro adverts on these two pages, including IJK Software and Acorn Soft. So loads of interesting stuff to look at in this magazine if you want to check it out for yourself, but now it's time to look at the games listing that I'm interested in for this one. And here it is, and the game is actually called Muncher, but you wouldn't necessarily know that because it doesn't clearly say that anywhere on these two pages. What it does say is, here comes the maze munch, and there's a picture in the middle of a pie-shaped character with a big mouth coming out of the TV chasing a man. You can probably guess that this is a Pac-Man clone, but whoever drew that image in the middle there clearly never played Pac-Man because, well, that just doesn't happen in Pac-Man. So let's zoom in and look at more detail about this game. And it says, a deceptively easy game to start with, this BBC version of a well-known arcade game written by David Gritton is definitely worth getting your teeth into. The game in this article is a very enjoyable and addictive game for the 32K BBC Model B. It's slightly different from the arcade implementation in that there are only two ghosts who can go through walls, and the function of the power pills is to stop the ghost chasing the muncher for a few seconds, giving him a chance to beat more dots and get to higher sheets. So it is a Pac-Man clone, but it's doing something a little bit different than being just a straight copy of the arcade game. It then goes into further detail, which I'm not going to go into at this point because I'll talk about that when we look at the game. What I am going to do is just move over here and take a look at some of the stuff it says about the programming. So what's interesting is it says if you want to change the number of ghosts, you can change the value of ng% in line 11. It's also an advisory against converting it to other computers because the program uses many special functions of the BBC. But if you want to try it, then there's a whole list of things that are BBC specific there that you couldn't do on other computers that have basic. But if you wanted to change those things, it gives you suggestions of how to do that. Again, I'm not going to go through that in too much detail. One thing I wanted to pick out just over here is that it says here the program puts the whole screen into array $, and you can use this array to see if the man is trying to go into a wall or has eaten something. So that's quite a clever idea, to put the whole maze into an array for the game, and then you can check that against the position of the character to see whether they're about to hit a wall or collect a dot or hit an enemy or something like that. That's quite a clever way of doing things. It also mentions here the highest score so far attained is 10,154,250, achieved after playing continuously for several hours and reaching sheet 999. I can tell you now, there's no way I'm going to be trying to do that when I play this game and show it in action. So I'm going to take just a quick look through the listing. I don't think it's doing anything particularly special compared to the other listings we've looked at. So you can see straight away it's using procedures again. So there's some variables being set up at the top here, and what stands out there is $2032. That's a two-dimensional array as mentioned for holding the details of the maze layout. There's also HSC% being set to 0, that's the high score, and $H being set to nobody, that's the person who's got the high score to begin with. So it's holding a high score. Don't think there's a high score table in this one, just the high score and the name of who set it. There's some things being set up there, envelopes, lives, things like that we've seen before. There's some VDU commands here that are setting up the character sprites for the game, but what's interesting is they're all in one row. So VDU 23254, that's setting up one, and then if you skim along a little bit, it's doing 23252, which is setting up another one, and then move along again, you've got 23245, and that's another one being set up. So that's something we've not seen before, where they're setting up multiple sprite characters all in one line. There's another procedure here that's controlling your man, which is the little Pac-Man character in this case. It's got if life % equals 0, then mproc, so that's obviously killing you off. It's also got $A equals in key $, which is selecting keyboard input, and you can see then it's checking for N, M, A or Z, which is the movement controls. So moving down, there's a procedure here for moving the ghosts around as well there. I'm just going to skip past that and look at def proc maze. This is the definition for the maze, and I thought that was quite interesting to look at because of this array that it's using. I'm presuming this massive data statement here is basically telling you how many sections of maze to put in a certain area. There's just a huge line of numbers. You can also see that some more characters are being configured here, 247 and 246, and 246 being all 255s means basically that's a blocky square, and then it uses those in the definition of the maze, because here's that array SC $, and you can see it's setting certain values to character 247, and probably somewhere else in there it's setting some of them to 246 as well. But anyway, let's move on. Lots of other stuff going on there, but it's nothing we've not really seen before in terms of new coding techniques. It then moves over onto the opposite side on the opposite page, and again there's just basically some text it prints to the screen, such as you're dead and the highest score so far, where it uses those high score variables that were configured earlier on. Asks you if you want another game, and there's also a small procedure at the end there, it proc instructions, which is just obviously showing the instructions, which are quite clearly displayed there. So as I say, nothing too special about this one, not particularly long listing. Again, it's about 90 lines I think, not using the usual format of each line being divisible by 10. It's just going like 90, 91, 92, so no margin for inserting extra lines. If you wanted to, you'd have to renumber the listing if you wanted to add new stuff into it. So that's enough of looking at the listing for this one. Let's now move on and take a look at the game. Once again, before you start the game, you get some instructions. As you can see, Muncher, copyright David Griffin, 26th of June 1982. Very specific to put the date it was created in there. And it says, in this game you must move a man around a maze, eating dots as you do so. He's being pursued by two evil ghosts who can only be stopped by eating a flashing thunderbuster, and even then for a short while only. So it's specifying you're a man rather than a Pac-Man, but as you'll see when the game starts, you are actually just a Pac-Man. So it goes on to say, after clearing a maze, a new one is given. Every fifth maze is invisible, just to add extra interest and difficulty, so that's a unique touch for this game. An extra man's given every 10,000 points. What it doesn't mention there is you also get a bonus when you complete each stage, but we'll see that once the game's underway. So it finishes off by telling you what the keyboard commands are, which could be changed if you wanted to in the game code, and then you press any key to play. So interestingly, it draws all the dots on screen first, then covers them up with the maze walls, and you start in the top left corner, and as you can see, you're pretty much a Pac-Man. He doesn't open and close his mouth as he moves around the game, he just stays with an open mouth. That's because of the simple characters that are used in basic programs. You can see the two ghosts moving around. They can go through the walls, and they basically just home in on you wherever you go, so you need to keep moving around the maze to avoid them. To begin with, they move pretty slowly, so it's not too hard to get away from them. Just like in the real arcade game of Pac-Man, each dot's worth 10 points, and the Thunderbusters, or Power Pills as you might better know them, are worth 100 points each and stop the ghosts dead for a short period of time. The maze layout is unique to this game, it's not copied from the Pac-Man layout. You can escape from one side of the screen to the other horizontally and vertically, unlike in real Pac-Man. And also what's quite interesting is that in some areas of the maze there are corridors that are 2 spaces wide rather than 1, so you get 2 rows or columns of dots. So you make your way around the maze, eating all the dots, using those Thunderbusters to stop the ghosts for a short period of time when you need to. Another difference from real Pac-Man is that you can't kill the ghosts, you can only freeze them. So once you've collected all the dots, the level ends, and you get bonus points, which is 1,000 multiplied by whatever level number you're on. So as you progress through the levels, the ghosts start to move faster, and that obviously makes it more difficult. One interesting thing is that when you do lose a life, the level ends immediately, so you don't get that end of level bonus, and you move on to another harder level, so it's really quite important to not lose lives, which is obviously true of any game really. Unfortunately, this game suffers from a problem that a lot of early Pac-Man clones had, especially the ones done as basic listings in magazines, and that's that your player sprite doesn't move constantly like Pac-Man did in the arcades. So rather than being able to fluidly move around corners by pushing in the direction you want to go before you reach it, you're constantly having to hold a button down to make him go in the direction you want to. With the slightly peculiar layout of the maze in places, that does make it quite difficult to get all the dots without being homed in on by those ghosts. When you get to the 5th level, and every 5th level thereafter, the walls disappear, so that does add something unique to this interpretation of the game and makes things quite challenging. To begin with, it's pretty obvious where the walls are even though you can't see them, because the dots are telling you where the walls aren't, but the more dots you pick up, the harder it is to work out what's a wall and what's empty space. You can briefly make the walls reappear by collecting one of the power pills. In terms of graphics and sound, the game's not too bad. Everything does the job quite well and it's reasonably playable. It pretty much looks and sounds the part, but it doesn't really feel like Pac-Man. So the game might serve well as a stand-in if you hadn't got Acorn Soft's Snapper, but to be honest, there were probably better Pac-Man clones available as typing games not long after this one. So while it wasn't a particularly long listing to type in, I'm not sure it offered that much value even back then. That rounds off this episode and finishes my look at selected BBC Micro typing games from 1982. When you compare the programs I've looked at in this episode to those in the first one, you can already see an improvement in the quality and complexity of the games being published. The 3 space-themed games stand out from this bunch, each being a very different type of game, but all of them showing a higher level of depth and programming expertise. Of those 3, the one that impressed me the most is Tarragon, with its clever use of graphical drawing commands to create a cockpit view shooter. A really smart programmer could have probably taken that game and merged it with Trek 3, using it to represent an encounter with a Klingon ship, and the 2 games combined would be quite impressive. As for Canyon and Muncher, the most noteworthy aspects from those 2 are the introduction of code for a high score table and the use of 2-dimensional arrays, which gave the listings some value even if the actual games aren't particularly good. If you're interested in checking any of these games out or want to delve deeper into the magazines that they were featured in, then check out the pinned comment on this video for links to all of them. And if you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like and leave a comment with any thoughts you have about the games or magazines featured. Next time around, I'll be moving on to 1983 and the first of several episodes covering that year. I'll take a look at 4 games from another range of magazines, including the debut of the Micro User, which would quickly become one of the premier sources of information and game listings for the BBC Micro. I hope you'll join me for that, and until then, stay tuned to this channel for more retro gaming content. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.